We hear from our former presidents. Certainly we hear from probably President Clinton and President Obama a little bit more than President Bush. But we don't actually, except for their books that they write subsequent to being in the White House, we don't see writings from them, I think, on a routine basis. We might hear a speech from them or an interview, but we don't see writings from them. So I think this was basically, from my perspective, this is a gift to the American people and an invitation to read these essays with an open mind and an appreciation of everything that they lived through being in the White House and all the lessons that they learned on leadership and democracy, and then allowing them to think about someone else's time in the White House, which is pretty unusual.
Hello and welcome to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program on America's 250th and the In Pursuit Project. My name is Eric Schickler. I'm a professor in the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science and co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. I want to give a special thanks tonight to the Travers Family Foundation for supporting this program. Now let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Colleen Shogan served as the 11th Archivist of the United States and is the CEO of In Pursuit, a bipartisan civic initiative marking America's 250th anniversary. The project brings together reflections from Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton, as well as First Ladies, Chief Justice John Roberts, and leading historians on American leadership, democracy, and the nation's future. Jack Rakove is co-professor of History and American Studies and professor of political science emeritus at Stanford University, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution. His other books include Revolutionaries, A New History of the Invention of America. Welcome to you both. I'm going to start out tonight with a question for Colleen as the person who is most responsible for this volume. So first, if you could just tell our audience a little bit about what is In Pursuit and why did you put this project together?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, Eric, for moderating. Thanks, Jack, for coming. And also thanks to the Commonwealth Club for hosting us. You did a great job in describing In Pursuit. It's a history-based civics initiative that was designed for 2026, which is, of course, the 250th anniversary of the United States. And it was put together after I left the National Archives. Quite frankly, I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. I've never been without a job in my entire adult life. And one day, a few weeks after my departure, I got a phone call from a few people that I knew in Washington, D.C., two very trusted people, Mark Updegrove, who runs the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, and Anita McBride, who had served as chief of staff to Laura Bush and is on the board at the White House Historical Association. And they said, Colleen, this organization More Perfect has raised some money for an initiative for 2026. And of course, I was familiar with More Perfect, run by also a Bush alum, John Bridgeland, and said, they want you to come and have a conversation to find out if you might want to come and run this project. And I said, well, it's been a bit of a challenging couple of years, and I was thinking about maybe taking a little bit time off before deciding my next move. But then, I got on a Zoom call and learned a little bit about it, which wasn't actually too much, except that they wanted to do a civics project for 2026 that would be about short essays about presidents and first ladies. And that was pretty much the scope of what it was that they had raised some seed money for. And I started to get excited about this project because when I served as Archivist of the United States, I had been involved very much in the America 250 planning. And one of the criticisms that I had that I would say in meetings was there's no national history project for 2026. Obviously the Smithsonian will have exhibits and the National Archives will do exhibits and other cultural institutions, the Library of Congress will do their thing, but where is the collective history project for 2026, and no one really wanted to touch it. Because everybody said the same thing. Things are too politicized, they're too polarized in this country. If we try to do something, it will get taken over by one side or the other, and it'll cause basically more problems than it will solve. And so here it was, there was a big gift put right on my lap, saying, if you want to do this, go for it. So I thought, this is a sign that one thing has ended, but another thing has begun, and this is the opportunity I have to really construct a national history project for 2026. So, I just went to work, and collectively, I've been in DC, lived in DC for a couple decades, and I have a fairly good Rolodex. And being the Archivist of the United States, you run into some people, and it turned out when I explained we wanted to do this nonpartisan project where we would bring together some of the best minds across the United States from different walks of life, public service, historians, some political scientists as well, journalists, other thought leaders. And we wanted them to think about what lessons we could learn from the past, using our presidents and first ladies as really the lens to history. How could we uncover those lessons from the past about democracy, about leadership, about character? How could we do that so that we could inform our present and prepare us, hopefully, for the next 250 years? When I went out to ask people to do it, I'm telling you, very few people said no. I mean, I could count them less than all on one hand of the people that said no. So I thought, okay, we're on the right track here. I think this is gonna work out. And of course, one of the people I went to was Jack to write the essay. He wrote the essay on James Madison.
Right. Thanks so much. And we're going to get to the Madison essay in just a moment. I guess I wanted, before turning to Jack on that, though, I wanted to ask just another question, Colleen. So, what do you see as some of the big takeaways from the project?
Right.
What do we learn kind of collectively?
Yeah, I'm one of only, I think, 2 or 3 people who have read all the essays because they're being published sequentially in chronological order. We started on President's Day with President Bush's essay on George Washington, and we're just moving through with one president and first lady every week, all the way through to December. So we're midway through. We haven't this week actually. Our joint dissertation advisor, Stephen Skowronek, wrote an essay on Rutherford B. Hayes and civil service. It was very, very interesting. So some of the things that we've learned, and I can take a little step back. One of the things that was very interesting to me that I've learned is the role of compromise in a democracy. And I guess I hadn't ever really thought of it this way, but it became evident. And we've actually gone through those essays, a lot of them, so I can talk about it. The period before the Civil War, starting really in the 1830s, then running all the way up into the Civil War, everybody thinks of compromise as being a necessary feature of a democracy, of a large democracy like the United States, a constitutional democracy, a republican democracy. You need to have compromise. And that's absolutely true. That's not untrue. But when you look at certain portions of American history, you learn about the limits of compromise. And that sometimes when we compromise, we actually make things worse. That when there are moral dilemmas that the country faces, for example, of course, the issue of slavery, when there are those types of dilemmas and crises facing the country, you see example after example of presidents actually trying to do what they thought was the best thing, which was find another way out of it, find yet another compromise, figure out a way to keep the country together. But every step of the way, as you read the essays in sequential order, you actually figure out that they literally made things worse, to where the only way to solve the problem was then through violence and through a long civil war. So that was interesting because I had never really thought of really studying and thinking critically about when compromise works, when compromise doesn't work, and how to apply that to a larger lesson about democracy. And then another thing that I found very interesting is what's really struck me, and I have actually an essay coming out in the Washington Post in the next couple of weeks about this, which is really about how much failure teaches us. I mean, I was just astounded by, yes, I mean, we all want to celebrate our successes and think about our successes, but I think this is a lesson for everyone. You don't have to be a president of the United States or a first lady of the United States to think about things this way. This is applicable to everyone in your own life, that we actually learn more from our failures, in our failures of leadership than we learn from the great successes. And I think In Pursuit shows that. We can learn more from some of the presidents, and every president, we tried it, even the most successful ones in the essays, we're trying to figure out things that did not work for that particular president or for that first lady and identifying them. And I think those were some of the most insightful parts of the essays.
Great, thanks so much. And that does lead nicely, I think, into thinking about Madison. So James Madison's often referred to as the father of the Constitution, yet one of the things you point out in your essay is that there are many aspects of that document that disappointed Madison, weren't what he wanted. And so I guess I want to ask you is, given that, this kind of ambivalence that Madison felt toward the Constitution, in a sense, or toward that product, what do you see as the lessons we can learn about leadership from how he acted and how he responded in that situation?
Eric, I think I could start by saying in response to Colleen's last remarks that the one compromise Madison hated or detested the most was the one giving us an equal vote
in the Senate.
And actually, I wrote a piece, a month or so ago, or a couple months ago, in the Washington Monthly on, three moments when the convention could have taken a different course had the large state delegates just stuck together and say, one way or another, we're going to have proportional representation in both houses of Congress. So that's an immediate response to everything Colleen was just saying. I think my point of departure is, it is common to say, or to describe Madison as the father of the Constitution. It's not a bad term. It has an honorific quality. It's a compliment, for lots of obvious reasons. But if you think analytically, if you want to try to explain what happened, being the father of the Constitution isn't a very useful category or framework of analysis. So I've been working on Madison for a long time, literally going back to the Nixon years when I was at graduate school, and he figured prominently in my first book, which was a history of the Continental Congress, the body, our first federal, our first national government under the Articles of Confederation. And I still find, half a century more later, new questions to ask about his thinking and his analysis. So, partly in thinking about the coming of the 250th anniversary, and partly in reacting to work done by other scholars, kind of developed the idea that there's a better way to characterize and to analyze Madison's activities, particularly in the 1780s. Madison went off to the Continental Congress in March 1780. He served there without going back to Montpelier, the family plantation outside Orange. He never went home once. And then, ironically enough, Eric, you may not know this, he's the first guy to be term limited out of Congress, as Patrick Henry was term limited out of the governorship of Virginia. And then he went into the Virginia House of Delegates, the lower house, the Assembly. So I felt from the moment Madison entered Congress in what was actually the bitter winter of 1780, much worse than the Valley Forge winter, he was actively involved in really every phase of dealing with the final ratification, then the early amendment of the Articles of Confederation, and then the efforts in the mid-1780s to get those amendments adopted. How they broke down in 1786 and at the Annapolis Convention, which was a kind of last gasp effort to come up with some alternative method of proposing amendments. And then there was the fact that the Annapolis Convention was in effect a failure. He has a dozen delegates from 5 states, which is fine by itself, but it wasn't a large enough body to do anything significant. Mm-hmm. So that's when you get the issue of the call to have a general convention to meet in Philadelphia on May, theoretically on May 14th, 1787. And then I think Madison took the initiative in terms of putting together what really became the first working agenda for the convention, embodied in the Virginia Plan, and so on. And then there are other things that happened in the aftermath. So think about Madison as as a political actor, not just as a great political thinker, the author of Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, which are kind of the locus classicus for the idea that we have a Madisonian Constitution. Madison, think of him as a guy who theorized deeply about politics, but he did so in the course of political action. And so the moral, I won't say the moral of the story, but the obvious set of issues that arises is, how did Madison's theorizing affect his actual political behavior, given the initiative he took, I think, in nearly every critical moment, in terms of all the different steps that were necessary first to, try to ratify the articles, get them amendment. When that fails, let's try Annapolis, that doesn't work, let's try Philadelphia. And then what do you do at the convention? And then not only what do you do at the convention, once you have the articles agreed to, how do you go about ratifying the Constitution? And I think there are a lot of aspects of the ratification story that a lot of scholars, I think legal scholars, some of my fellow historians, there's some, I won't say technical, there's some substantive aspects to what goes on in ratification whose significance we don't really appreciate. And I'll just add a kind of modern postscript. If you're as pessimistic about the state of the American polity today as I am, the question of how do you strategize avenues of constitutional reform, I think, is going to become a live question for us. And we have lots of reasons, we'll probably get to them later, why I think this. So, no, I'm not sure that's about drawing lessons. Historians, I think, actually are, one of my professors back in graduate school, Ernest May, was very cautious about the idea that you should draw lessons. In fact, the best lesson you should draw from history, if you want to apply it to actual political action, is how do you distinguish the current case you're dealing with from cases that seem similar, but were actually, in some critical respect, different. So in one sense, I'm not a big advocate of drawing lessons, because I think historians in that sense should be skeptics, should teach us to think critically about our inclination to draw lessons. Right. On the other hand, if you're in a critical situation, which I think I do think we are in, or worse than critical situation, then how do you think strategically? There may be some plausible morals lessons to be drawn from Madison's behavior.
Right. Well, let me just follow up briefly on this. So Colleen was talking about compromise, and when should you accept a compromise and when should you reject it. Madison went in with certain fundamental goals at the convention. They weren't satisfied. He hated, as you said, the equal representation of states. So why did he decide to accept this compromise?
The basic story I tell is that, when the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians, in May 1787, they're the first delegations to be present. The Virginians were there on time because they had invited the other states. The Pennsylvanians were there on time because, Philadelphia, happened to be the capital. You have to be the capital. So they get together and they basically draw what Madison had done. But there's a lot of collaboration, I think, between people, particularly people like James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris. And Pennsylvania delegates, who were there, and they actually discuss: should we get the small states to relinquish the equal state vote in terms of the voting within the convention? And Madison basically said, I'm inferring a lot, but I think I'm correct. Madison basically says no. Madison was convinced you could prevail on them in the course of argument to realize that they didn't deserve an equal vote in either house of the new Congress. And then in the end, I think Madison felt they'd have no place else to go if the large states get with some support from other states, could get together and put a document together. What was Delaware going to do? What was New Jersey going to do? Particularly Delaware, hardly anybody lives there. And Rhode Island was absent. I'd like to say, if Rhode Island dropped into the Atlantic Ocean, who would know? Except the Rhode Islanders. So they did have an initial moment where they could have tried pursuing another strategy. There's a second moment that takes place on July 17th, which was the day after the so-called great, or some people call it the Connecticut Compromise, but actually it wasn't a compromise. It's everyone in the audience should know this. It was a vote of 5 states to 4, with one, the populous state of Massachusetts, divided. So there's no compromise on July 16th. 1777. One side is won, and the other side is lost. And on the 17th, the large state delegates caucus, but some of the small state guys drop in and want to say, "No, what's up? And they couldn't reach a consensus. You know, I think they decided in the end you had to go forward with it, even though you had the result you didn't want. And so then at the end, when you get to the end of the convention, you know, Madison winds up writing the last 2 essays he contributed to the Federalist. You know, the 85 essays that Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison co-wrote. Madison's last 2 essays were Federalist 62 and 63, which are a defense of the Senate. Madison really believed we needed a Senate. As a student of legislative deliberation, he felt that the absence of a Senate, in what was perhaps already an overly democratized society, the absence of a Senate would be institutionally a mistake. You needed to have a body constituted on different principles. Because sometimes the lower house would act impulsively if you give these guys 6-year terms and on staggered rotation, so 1/3 go out each year. It would be a great stabilizing force, and that's fine. But when he wrote those 2 essays, he made it plain that the reason we have, he never defended the equal state vote per se as such. He said, well, the reason we have it is, and I can't remember if he uses the term compromise or not, but it was made necessary by political circumstances. And I've rethought that a lot. I'll just toss this out as a question. We can think about it later. But if we were to have a constitutional convention now, would all you in the audience or those who will listen to this program eventually, would you give the states an equal vote in a future convention? Or if you wanted to rethink it, how would you do it? So that puts us back in Madison's shoes, which for me has been kind of fun in its own way, but also is daunting.
Right. I suspect the answer to that might depend a lot on where people are sitting. Here in California, they may have a different answer. So Colleen, I wanted to ask a little bit about, one of the features you noted about this volume, which is the participation of former presidents writing these essays. For those of us who were not archivists of the United States, don't have those Rolodexes necessarily. What was it like? What was the process like getting essays from these former presidents? And what do you think their participation adds to the project?
Right. Yeah. Sure. I mean, to tell you the truth, the process working with them was very easy. Getting them on board, it wasn't like, hey, you ask someone, President Bush or President Obama or President Clinton to write an essay and the answer is in your inbox maybe the next day. So it took a little bit of time because, they do have teams around them and they make decisions on a rolling basis about things they're going to participate in. So it was a little bit of a negotiation over the course of a few months about what was going to happen. And that became a little challenging only because we were asking other people to write essays going along. And I was also holding some of the essays back, trying to guess what presidents, they might want to write on, because I had a pretty good inclination they would join the project, but I didn't know who they were going to choose. And unlike some people that I could say, hey, I'm asking you to write the essay on this particular president or this particular first lady, when you go to a former president or a former first lady, you don't probably assign them that you're going to write on this person. You have to say, oh, you of course you get to pick, what person you want to write on. So there was just a little bit of switching there at the end when they let us know who they might want to write on. But once that was settled, it was, the process was very easy. I can say all 3 of them, actually. So President Bush's essay, President Obama's essay have been published already. So they're on inpursuit.org, and we're also on Substack on In Pursuit. So you can find their essays already. President Clinton's essay is forthcoming in August. But I can say for all 3 of them, they did one draft, initial draft, and 2 revisions. So the essay went through 3 drafts, and then at the end, that was for all 3 of them. And I don't think they coordinated it, but they were all like, this is done. So this is all 3 of them. Very similar processes, very receptive to any suggestions that we had. President Bush, whenever he was thinking about George Washington, he did ask to be on the phone, have a phone conversation with Doug Bradburn, who runs Mount Vernon, and wanted to just run a few ideas and hear what Doug had to say about President Washington, and have a little bit of like an idea generating session with him. And I think that was really helpful. And that's how he came up with this idea that he wanted to write about humility in Washington, because that was something that was discussed in that conversation, and President Bush seized on that idea. I think President Obama had written actually about Lincoln even when he was president. He had written about the Gettysburg Address when he was in the White House, and actually when I was at the Library of Congress, he had come with his daughters to view the second inaugural, which is not on permanent display at the Library of Congress, but it went on special display, and he came at a time when the library wasn't open, so he could view that address with both of his daughters. So I think he has a very special relationship with Lincoln, and thinks very constructively about Lincoln. So I think that this was an interesting thought exercise for him, especially now being a former president, not being in the White House writing about Lincoln and speaking about Lincoln, maybe having a little bit of different viewpoint on it. And then President Clinton, I think, has been a lifelong fan of Teddy Roosevelt and TR, and he really, seized upon the opportunity and has. I think he's very excited. He wants to go see the new TR Library in Medora, and so I don't think this was a terribly difficult task for him, although I know from talking with his team, when I would check in on the essay, I'd say, well, he really doesn't want to let it go. He's working on it, and we really want him to be finished, because we have, like 50 other things for him to do. And but he's really excited about this essay. So I think that he brought great enthusiasm. And then same thing. Actually, the first ladies all had their essays in. You might not be surprised about this. They had them all in early, and they were all like really well done. I mean, I just can't speak enough. We're going to be getting to those. They haven't. None of them have come out yet, but we have Laura Bush wrote a lovely essay on Lady Bird Johnson, Michelle Obama on Jackie Kennedy, and Hillary Clinton on one of her own personal heroes, Eleanor Roosevelt. Those came in very quickly and very well done. But I think what it brings to the project, I mean, obviously it brings some attention to the project, but I also think we hear from our former presidents. Certainly we hear from probably President Clinton and President Obama a little bit more than President Bush, but we don't actually, except for their books that they write subsequent to being in the White House, we don't see writings from them, I think, on a routine basis. We might hear a speech from them or an interview, but we don't see writings from them. So I think this was basically, from my perspective, this is a gift to the American people, and an invitation to read these essays with an open mind and an appreciation of everything that they lived through being in the White House, and all the lessons that they learned on leadership and democracy, and then allowing them to think about someone else's time in the White House, which is pretty unusual. So, I think it brought just a degree of uniqueness to the project and interest, and very excited about it. But all the essays, quite frankly, are really, really well done. Not one came in that wasn't thoughtful and didn't really answer the questions that we asked of the authors.
That's great. I guess while you're waiting for the Clinton essay, have you been thinking about what you're going to do if it comes in at like 3,000 words?
Well, I will say, there's it's done, so it's completed. But in all of the essays are short. They're only between about 1,200 and 1,300 words. We did allow previous presidents a little bit of leeway there. So President Bush's essay was a little bit over, and President Clinton's essay is a little bit over. I think Barack Obama's was actually right in that range. But the deal is that there's a one-sentence sort of topic sentence in the beginning that is what we call the lesson, but it's the thesis of the essay, and we just want one sentence, and we want it to be kind of short and memorable. It's really based upon this idea of Ben Franklin's practical wisdom, his aphorisms that we think of in the almanac, those types of things. So it's a hearkening back to the Revolutionary era. President Clinton, I will say, he wrote like the world's longest sentence. I said, no, but first I said he wrote like more than one sentence. I said, no, it has to be one sentence. And then he wrote like the world's longest sentence. And I was like, you can't just have like 4 semicolons in the sentence. So that was probably the biggest, edit that we had to do was to get that a little bit succinct.
Yeah, I have memories of those State of the Union addresses that were. So Jack alluded to a little bit about the times we're living in now, and Colleen, you also talked about the reticence about doing a history project, quote unquote, in this polarized era. So a question I want to ask is, can we tell a national story of our past in a time of so much division and polarization? And if so, how can we do that?
Mm-hmm.
Eric, when you say we, who is the we?
That is an open question. That is a question for each of you to take as you want.
Well, I think historians have an obligation to write the best history they can write. It's hard for historians to have a direct impact on public opinion. I've tried hard over the course of my year. I've written lots of op-eds. I now have, as I said, a line to Washington Monthly if I feel like doing something journalistically. There's going to be, I think half a dozen opportunities now. I'm going to have an essay on the 4th of July called "Is It the 4th?" which is supposedly Thomas Jefferson's last words, and I play around with that. I think the deeper question, thinking about the moment, is we are living in what is, I think, actually in many ways, the strangest and most threatening moment in American history. I think, in certain respects, I think it's worse than 1861. Well, 1861 is easier to explain in a certain sense, because the South was so deeply invested in chattel slavery. Why they thought the election of a Republican president with the Northern majority would be a fatal or deathly blow to the security of the peculiar institution, chattel slavery. To me, that's always been a puzzle, but being more of an 18th century guy than a 19th century one, I haven't worked that out. I do think the facts of both Trump's first term, but especially his second term, and especially post-January 6th, 2021, are such novel circumstances. And a number of the other aberrations that have gone on, that have, kind of, I was going to say conspired, that have been, concomitant with the Trump presidencies, they're very difficult to explain. I think historians, if I try to imagine historians 20 years from now, 40 years from now, from 60 years from now, trying to make sense of what happened in the United States in the second decade of the 20th century, then, of course, the question for historians is, how far back do you push it? So these are truly serious questions. So the question of how you write a history is itself, Eric, I'm not criticizing the question, but I'm saying it's deeply problematic. In my own experience, so I've been on the road a lot since mid-April. I've had a bunch of gigs, a couple of judicial conferences, several academic conferences, a couple of lectures here and there, all relating to the 250th anniversary. And I think what strikes me is that in many ways, much of what's happening is what you would expect to happen. There's a ton of books coming out about the Declaration of Independence, lots of collections of essays, and some of them are quite good. I mean, one named Emily Sneff has a book that I think has just come out called "When the Declaration Was News" or something. She really traces, and I just met her for the first time at a conference at the American Philosophical Society. So she traces how was the Declaration absorbed in public opinion, broadly defined. When did people know that Jefferson actually was the main author? I mean, it wasn't clear ab initio from the very beginning. And there are other works like this. And of course, Americans, for lots of good reasons, we are engrossed with, embedded in. I mean, for us, the 5 most famous words in American English are "all men are created equal." What do we mean by that? And how do we think about equality? Which is, it's talking about equality is not an open and shut concept. Is that equality is itself very dynamic. So I think there's actually a lot of great stuff going on there academically, which is, I think it's quite good. I mean, some of it is repetitive. I'm probably being repetitive here tonight since some of these things I've been thinking about for a long time. Some of it's repetitive, of things already written, but a lot of it is new, and it shows how scholars, once they get actively engaged, continue to generate new ideas. But the opposite side of this story is, it is my belief that our constitutional system it's not in a crisis, it's in a state of failure. And I'm actually, on my own time, I'm working on a kind of maybe a kind of poli-sci-ish article, which I call A Theory of Constitutional Failure, the American Case. Historians don't theorize. We interpret events, but we're not big theorists. But I'm trying to, since I was a voting member of Stanford Poli-Sci, I may have a residual right to theorize, when the spirit moves me. And so, I mean, how do we juxtapose the celebrations and the commemorations and the reflections, which are all earnest, which are well-meaning, with the reality of our system? I mean, my basic point is, as soon as my starting point, I think about this, is that, I think we have a notion of living in a constitutional crisis. And I decided early on that the idea of crisis was itself inadequate. Because to re-elect a president who was responsible for January 6th, who is now under the so-called unitary executive theory, is the sole holder of the executive power of the United States. That's not a crisis. That means some kind of endemic failure has already taken place. And it could be a failure on the part of the electorate. But it also means you're creating a situation. It's not just going to have a crisis here, a crisis there, a brouhaha now, a brouhaha then. You're going to live in a condition which really implies underlying constitutional instability. And so I've been trying to generalize this, and I do think that if you take a step back from the moment, and July 4th is only not that far off. 9 days off now, 8 days off. You have to do the arithmetic, but the juxtaposition of where the nation is politically with the commemorative activities, the latter are fine. They're great. They're taking the course you'd imagine. And we're learning a lot of new stuff. But how you make sense of the situation we're in now is going to remain a puzzle, I think, for generations to come.
No.
Colleen?
I mean, I don't disagree with a lot of what Jack said. I would say for me as a political scientist, and this is different, Eric and I are both political scientists, we're always thinking about why and why is it, and I think that's a very complicated question. It's likely overdetermined. There's a lot of explanations why. Right. One of the reasons we're in the situation that we're in is of our own making easily, and I think it's not the only reason, but it is a major reason, is that we have not paid attention to civics and history education in this country for several decades. And we are now seeing the effects of our neglect. There's a lot of reasons for why that happened. Very well-meaning focus on science and mathematics and technology, STEM subjects, starting in the 80s and into the 90s. Once again, my brother's an engineer. My dad worked in engineering, and a lot of my family is in that area. So it's not like, I don't have anything against that. But I do think that because of that focus, there's only time is finite in a classroom, so you had to take the time from somewhere, and where that came from, some of it came from arts and music, but a lot of it came from social studies, and primary school kids in the United States, less than 3 hours of social studies in a given week, and middle school very spotty on whether or not civics and history education is taking place. high school, more likely you're going to have a semester of civics before you graduate in most states in the United States. But even that being said, the scores, which are not routinely measured, there's not uniform testing like there is in math and in science, but when it is given, the scores are not good. And then we also have surveys just asking adult Americans basic questions about how our government operates. I mean, I'm not talking about things even we're talking about tonight. I'm talking about how many branches of government are there, which branch of government is responsible for drafting the laws, things that we would expect people to be able to answer. And the number of Americans that are able to really answer those questions in some surveys it can be lower than 50%. So we are in a crisis. Like I said, I don't think this is the only explanation for why we're in the situation that we're in. But my analogy, I like to use sports analogies. But imagine if you were watching a football game in the United States and you didn't know any of the rules. No one explained you the rules. I'm talking about not soccer, but which is, I'm talking about real, like actual football, like what we think of American, football. Imagine you're watching that game and no one told you the rules. Now, after you watched, several hours, many hours and many games, you would start to be able to intuit the rules of the game. But it would take you a while to figure out if you were just watching it and no one sat down and explained to you and taught you the basics of how football is played. And our American government, the constitutional system is somewhat, complex. You've got, many different features. You've got federal, system of government. You've got, then you have to understand, state and local and how that interacts and the branches and all these different features to understand. And we're expecting people to be able to function as fully formed citizens and make good decisions, but we haven't explained to them or they haven't learned the rules of the game. And that's the basic minimum of being able to function. So, I can't solve the whole problem for sure. No one person or no single project is going to be able to do that. But I hope by what we're doing, at least with In Pursuit, is trying. We have obviously K-12 resources, and we're trying to hit different populations. But quite frankly, In Pursuit is an adult history and civics education project. We are looking to have resources for younger people, but we are also looking for people who have already left maybe their formal schooling, so that it can be for them either a refresher or a time to think about some of the things that we've learned from the past, so we can think about some of the decisions we make for the future.
Great, thanks. I need to follow up just a little bit. So I've been on this point about civics. So one of the things I've been working on right now with some grad students at Berkeley is thinking about how the parties have changed their views on education. And we wrote a paper on higher education last year, but we're working now on K-12. And one of the striking things is that you really see a difference between the parties in kind of how they talk about civics and what we should be educating our young people. So just to give you an example, Republicans often talk about reliance on the original founding documents and the wisdom of the founders, whereas Democrats talk about a more kind of expansive story. They actually talk less about curriculum than Republicans, interestingly, but I think at least implicit in it is a kind of quote unquote modern history of the founding that points out some of the shortcomings, for example, of the Constitution. And so I guess as you're thinking about this project trying to bring us, in some sense, bring the country together with civics, how do you wrestle with just the kind of basic conflict about which stories should we emphasize, which elements of our Constitution or our constitutional founding moment, for example, should we privilege or focus on, and which maybe do we not talk about as much?
Right. I mean, for In Pursuit, I mean, we're this iteration of the project, at least in 2026, we're looking at through the lens of history, through the lens of the presidency. Although the first ladies led us to have a little bit more of wiggle room, different types of stories and things like that. But I was really adamant when I was the archivist I would get some variation of these questions all along, and the best history we can tell is an accurate history. Yeah. And we rely upon, as political scientists, we rely upon historians to help us because we're certainly not doing the historical work. We're relying upon historians to be able to do that, and then we come in with our theories and ideas to try to make macro political sense of it. But the best history is an accurate one, and so yes, is telling the story of our founding and understanding the founding principles and understanding the role that James Madison played in the convention and understanding the complexities and the contradictions and the ambiguities of Thomas Jefferson. Yes, all of those should be fair game, but that doesn't mean we have to stop with that. We have to also, remember what I said earlier, we also learn a lot from our failures. So we have to understand, how do we even appreciate why do we want to get to Lincoln? We want to get to Lincoln because we think there's some sort of catharsis there. But the only reason that Lincoln is a catharsis is because the four guys before him really failed. And you can compare and contrast them. So if we just skip those four guys and said, okay, we're not going to talk about the times that we failed, and we're just going to speed up to Lincoln, and we're just going to read the Abraham Lincoln essay, well, what appreciation do you have for Abraham Lincoln if you haven't seen the failed attempts that come before him and why he's presented with this type of decision? So I think it absolutely has to be both. I also want to say that there's something, I think, some weird divide, partisan ideologically, with some of the civics and some of the civic centers that are popping up in universities too. And it seems as though conservatives are saying, we want to teach Western tradition and the great books, and we're going to, learn the underpinnings of American constitutional government, of course, relying upon Enlightenment thinkers, but also classical thinkers as well. And I find all of these things to be very strange arguments because I don't view Aristotle as being conservative or liberal. I don't know of any teaching, any interpretation of Plato's Republic that's conservative or liberal that I'm aware of. These should not be just the bastion of the right. It shouldn't be the bastion of any political ideology. If we're going to confront the most pressing questions about what is just, what is right, what is expedient, what is the best form of government, we have to not do these things through an ideological lens. And it certainly should not be just the dominion of one particular political party. That's my own opinion.
Eric, I think what I'd add to this, and not to disagree with anything Colleen just said, but I think I would reformulate the question somewhat, or the problem. So when we speak about the framers or the founders or the revolutionary generation, we have kind of an inherent tendency to oversynthesize and to assume greater levels of agreement on a process of constitutional formation, which was itself inherently experimental in nature. The framers themselves in general, is certainly Madison in particular, because he was deeply self-reflective about it. And he participated in the first phase just as a young guy in the 5th Provincial Convention of Virginia, which wrote the Commonwealth of Virginia's first convention. Madison tried to recall, how were we thinking back then? And what lessons have we learned on the basis of experience that we might want to reapply? But I think the larger point I want to make here is that we tend to assume the framers and the founders, and of course the terms vary depending on the context. I'll use them somewhat interchangeably. I think we tend to oversynthesize, and I think the tougher thing to do, but it might be a better way to teach it actually, Colleen, is you want to, and I think it's what I do in my own work, so naturally I like this idea, is you want to try to figure out what was in dispute. Mm-hmm. What were the sources of disagreement? Why was, could you form consensus on some things? Would you have to compromise on others? Were you going to have to incorporate some disagreements because you haven't worked things out? And the single best example of this, and this is something I've been thinking about actively, is to think about the presidency. So since you guys are political scientists, I'm not going to surprise you by saying this, but it is the single most important institution in American politics. It is the most dynamic actor. The fact that the unitary, the executive part of the United States shall be vested in a single person, and so on, and shall be vested in the President of the United States, that itself is significant. The presidency was the subject of confusion and disagreement down to the very end. The final decisions on it were taken really in the last, really the first half of September. The most interesting changes came about from a body known as the Committee on Postponed Parts, which was a so-called, would have been called a grand committee with one member from every state, which was left with the postponed parts, what things that we not agreed on. What they not really agreed on was the presidency, and they make a lot of changes. I mean, it's the Committee on Postponed Parts that kind of finally comes down on the side of the Electoral College. It's the Committee on Postponed Parts that says trials of impeachment will not be done in the Supreme Court. They'll be done in the Senate, and the Chief Justice will only preside. They had to invent the Vice President, who actually, here's a little secret between you. The Vice President was not thought to be part of the executive branch until well into the 20th century. His one job, he had two jobs. First was staying alive, and because there's no point in having one if he's, Madison actually killed off both his vice presidents. But his other job was to be president of the Senate, and that's how they spent their days. The president pro tem of the Senate was elected only when the vice president was off on a lark or whatever. So I think the key thing you want to teach, I think particularly if you share my concerns that we have to now start thinking critically and creatively about where we are, you have to understand the disagreements as much as the points on which they were able to, in which they were able to agree. And I think actually, so I've been fortunate enough to, spend my life at Stanford University, which, and Berkeley's a pretty good place
Berkeley,
too.
but it's okay.
It's not Berkeley, but it's okay, it's, and I think actually living in the Bay Area with this wealth of great institutions is itself really, really a blessing. But, so, I've been able to teach this at a pretty high level, which is a great comfort. But I actually think engaging students in it at any level, and I've had a lot of experience doing what's called History Today, and I said C-SPAN had a competition recently, and you meet kids from, I think kind of from 5th grade on up, into high school. The kids who get engaged really get.
They're the best.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Well, by definition, they are the best. But I think it also tells you that if you challenge them, and you show them, here's how you can engage. We're not going to just teach you a lesson. Here's how you engage with the material. You get real benefits out of it. I mean, to talk about civic education, Colleen, or education in general, in the sense in which you're just referring to it.
Yeah, great. Just one last thought on the point about disagreement is it's also worth noting that, right after the Constitution's ratified, or very soon after, we enter a period of incredible rancor and division in the country with, that has some resonances with today. So, all right, so we have some great questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one for Colleen. Did contributors' different political perspectives shape which lessons they drew from history or create disagreements over how those lessons should be framed?
Right. We didn't see that. I will say when I approached people to write the essays, as common in these types of projects or an edited volume, I did send people a 2-page instruction, guidelines. And, one of the things in those guidelines was, please feel free to say what you think, and we want you to do the best possible job and, of course, an accurate job of what you're writing. But these are not political polemics. We're not litigating necessarily everything that's going on in the country today. Not that that's not important, but we are trying to focus on telling stories in the past. It can be informed by the present, and I think some people have done that in artful ways that make sense. But we didn't really see that, and we do have people that are definitely more either political figures or journalists who are more right of center. And I'm thinking of some of them are still forthcoming as far as their essays being published. But I don't think that when I think about the lessons or what they chose to focus on, I wouldn't say that those would be necessarily partisan or ideological lessons.
Great, thanks. So a question, I think this one could go to both, each of you could speak to. Commenter noted, Washington's restraint in leaving office is in a sense, lesson one in the volume. Is there a founding era lesson that's more cautionary than inspirational? One about a failure of leadership rather than a virtue? And I guess, Colleen, maybe based on the volume, Jack, based on your your work as a historian of that era.
I think I've studied mostly successes. I'm more happy to talk about failure today because so it seems so manifest. I mean, the point that came up earlier that Colleen was making about how does one think about compromise, and what are the costs? What I think about is there was a tradition of compromise. I mean, Eric, we have to see how responsive this is, but at least I'll get some ideas out there. I mean, there was a tradition of compromise that became, if not a ritual, but a recurring feature of American politics. Kind of from the Missouri, what's called the Missouri Question Crisis Controversy of 1821, the nullification crisis and how that's resolved. And then, the events that lead to the so-called compromise of 1850. And then out of the compromise of 1850, you get this desire it's kind of almost wishful thinking that maybe the Supreme Court can solve this. And that's why, Dred Scott is, one of many kind of what we call contrived cases, and we see it a lot, of course, in contemporary jurisprudence. In fact, we see it all the time. But the tradition runs pretty far back in American history that if we have an issue we want to test, let's formulate a case that will kind of resolve it. I think at the grandest level, I think we are dealing with, I think particularly with issues of race that are so deeply rooted in our nation's history, where you go back and look at what made failure possible, in the past. I used to tell my students that taught pretty regularly, taught a lecture course on the history of the Constitution. I used to say, the failure of Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, was the greatest tragedy in American history. That's why we had to have the second Reconstruction, which I remember quite well because I graduated high school in 1964. So, I was not politically active, but I was politically conscious at that age. And now the crazy thing is, as people are starting to argue, we're actually going to need a third Reconstruction because the way in which the Supreme Court is basically deconstructing the second Reconstruction. And I think that's the implication of the Calais case and then the footnote case from Alabama. So I think I'm not trying to fumble with this, but I do think if I think about this process, that's the problem we have to keep engaging and re-engaging with. There are a lot of things about Project 1619 I disagreed with. I think their approach to why the Americans declare independence in 1776, I just think it's cockamamie wrong. Just on strictly historical grounds. But the underlying issue of making race the preeminent, it's not the sole issue, but it is the preeminent problem that we fail. And so when I think about, going back to Colleen's point earlier, when compromise is ostensibly undertaken as such, turn out to be adversely consequential. It's a serious issue.
Yeah. I mean, from our early essays, I say that the historian at Monticello, Andrew Davenport, wrote our essay on Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote if you haven't read it, he wrote just a beautiful essay, it was an original essay on Thomas Jefferson. I wouldn't say it solves the contradictions that we know about Jefferson, but he's very open about Jefferson's and Jefferson is open with himself about his own failures, but Jefferson in his own mind. Now, whether we want to go along with this or not, this is where the essays are really there to ask more questions to ask questions of people, not necessarily settle things. But what Andrew explains in his essay is the way that Jefferson squares the idea that he has written, like Jack said, the most important words in American history about this pronouncement of equality, but he still is enslaving hundreds of people in Monticello himself, and knows that because of the debt that he has gotten himself in, that even worse, upon his death, he knows this, he's cognizant of this, he knows that these people, these families will be split up and they will undoubtedly be sold in order to try to mitigate the arrears that his estate is in. His solution is to say, as in a democracy, we can't always solve the problems that are in front of us. We have to look to the future. He had this real optimism about the role that the future plays. And this is why Jefferson does not want to bind generations. He has this idea that every generation and a half that there should be a rethinking of the constitutional system, because he doesn't want to bind future generations with the decisions that are made by present day politicians. He's always thinking a few generations ahead. He's always thinking of the future. In a democracy, we'll be able to solve some of these problems. So there's this extraordinary and beautiful and poetic optimism about Thomas Jefferson, but it confronts this horrible reality that he's created in his own life and that he knows he has not been able to solve for the nation that he helped found. So, that's certainly, I don't know if it's a partial failure, it's a full failure. That's for people that read the history to decide.
Right, yeah, and just one thing that strikes me listening to what both of you have said is, if you think about the founding generation, Madison and Jefferson among them, as experimentalists, right? And the Constitution as an experiment, it becomes possible to understand that you can simultaneously have failures in this political system and deep shortcomings while still having a patriotic history, in a sense, that recognizes, the promise of the vision and so on. And it seems like that balance or that idea is maybe what gets lost a little bit in the quote unquote history wars or civics wars that we see now. So stepping down from this sort of lofty level of, we have a very kind of concrete, I think, interesting question, Colleen. As a former archivist of the United States, how does this project differ from how the National Archives typically frames presidential history?
Well, that's a great question. National Archive, this is obviously getting into interpretations of history. We're not just writing essays, that are, factual. They did these 10 things while they were president, and that's it. These are interpretive essays that are trying to make an argument based upon historical facts and upon writings and records and all kinds of historical evidence. So in that sense, it is different than what the National Archives does, because the National Archives chiefly is there to preserve, protect, and share the nation's records. But the National Archives tries to do less in the work of interpretive history, and really tries to foster the idea that by providing those records to as many Americans as possible, we want historians, we want citizens to come in and make use of those records in whatever way you think is best, and then share those interpretations of the records with as many people as possible. So it is a little bit different. The presidential libraries, many of 13 of which are part of the National Archives system, of course, are there to share presidential records with researchers and those that come to the presidential libraries. And there are exhibits at presidential libraries that do some interpretation of history just by want of the number of stories. There's many stories you can tell from either a 4-year or an 8-year presidency, and you have to be able to condense that and whittle it down into an exhibit that you present at a presidential library. But even for things like that, the National Archives doesn't just do that work on its own. They consult and assemble teams of historians and other experts whenever an exhibit is being constructed, so that there's many, many voices in the room, so that we can make, so the National Archives can make educated and good decisions about the interpretation of and presentation, for example, of a president's time in the White House. So I would say it's not. I mean, the job is the same in that I get to travel around the country and still talk about American history and talk about the things that I love and the things that I care about. But I would say that that it's a little bit different. I wouldn't have been able to do this project as Archivist of the United States, I don't think.
Great, thanks. Then just one last question. And we've talked a lot about partisan division. There's also a division between people who pay attention to politics and people who bless their hearts, and they're probably maybe healthier in many ways right now than those of us who do pay attention.
Lower blood pressure, yeah, for sure.
Certainly lower, who don't. And so the question is just like, can this project or should this project or how might it reach not just this kind of civically engaged political obsessives and to that kind of broader public?
Yeah. Well, one thing I will speak just briefly is one thing that we've done is I was very concerned. We're looking at different. You can't just say anymore. The American audience is subdivided. We have a lot of different segments, and one segment that I was concerned we weren't reaching was even though we had K-12 audience covered, and we also have some university curriculum being drafted and written that will be ready next year. We weren't really targeting people in their 20s and 30s, and they truly consume information in a way that is different than people. I'm of Generation X, and it's just a different animal. And so I had to really go to work and think about that in a serious way, because we want to make sure that we were sharing what we had learned from these essays with as many Americans as possible. That was the goal of the project. So thankfully, I was able to forge a relationship with the Ad Council, which is a terrific nonpartisan organization that does all kinds of multimedia campaigns. And they said what we can do is we can work with a PR firm that is targeted specifically at Generation Z consumers. And we will go to social media and we will work with history influencers. There are history influencers out there on social media, and we're going to work with history influencers. We looked at a wide array of them because we wanted to make sure we had people, once again, who were some of them are teachers, some of them are people that do other types of, or just really what you might say, people that are interested in history, but aren't actively, engaged in academic historical enterprises, although some are. And we looked at a lot of different videos on Instagram and TikTok, and we narrowed it down to 4 history influencers that we thought would be really good for the In Pursuit brand. And we are now currently in week 2 out of a 4-week campaign to reach as many Gen Z listeners out there as possible. And I can't tell you, our first history influencer, she did a piece on Abigail Adams. And Joseph Ellis wrote the essay, and she did a 1-minute video based upon Joe Ellis's essay on Abigail Adams. And it got hundreds of thousands of views. Hundreds of thousands of views. Her hashtag is Hot Girl History, and she puts on her makeup while she tells you a story about history, and she does women's history. So that's why she picked Abigail Adams. And she told this fascinating story about Abigail Adams and Remember the Ladies, and what was marriage like in the 1700s, what's coverture. She went through all of that in this about 1-minute video, and I just watched the numbers go up, 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 and up. And this week we're on to Dolly Madison. We have actually a woman, history influencer who is a PhD, and she's done that and done this one, and it's similarly doing very, very well. So you have to look at other ways in which to communicate. We're communicating the same ideas, but we're using different venues in order to be able to do that.
Wow, that's a great story to end on. So our thanks to Colleen Shogan and Jack Rakoff for this conversation on In Pursuit and the meaning of America's 250th anniversary. I'd also like to thank again the Travers Family Foundation for supporting this program. For information about Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Eric Schickler. Thank you for joining us.